Tonight in Wales, President Obama and other NATO leaders discussed action against ISIS terrorists in Syria and Iraq. Today, American jets continued to pound the Sunni Muslim extremist group. There have been 127 U.S. airstrikes in Iraq in just over 3 weeks. ISIS says it has beheaded 2 American journalists in retaliation. Tomorrow, Mr. Obama will press the Turkish Prime Minister to do more, and Holly Williams shows us why.
As ISIS has grown, it's used neighboring Turkey, a key U.S. ally, as its staging ground. For 3 years, we've watched as the Turkish government has allowed fighters to stream across its borders, driven by its desire to topple Syria's dictator. In 2012, we interviewed the man in the yellow T-shirt. Mahmoud was a bulldozer salesman from Atlanta, Georgia, who returned to his homeland to join the battle against the Syrian regime.
We come in and out. The Turkish, they are, closing eyes, like when we cross.
Islamic extremists also took advantage of the Turkish turning a blind eye. In December, we filmed these men crossing illegally into the war zone in broad daylight. Many militants have been treated in Turkish hospitals and set up safe houses in Turkish border towns. And in this Turkish government refugee camp 2 years ago, we met these Syrian men who told us they regularly crossed back into Syria to fight and wanted to establish an Islamic state. The Turkish government says it's never helped ISIS and considers it a terrorist group. But Hurşit Güneş, a member of Turkey's opposition, claims his government has allowed ISIS to flourish because it prefers the group to the Syrian regime. He even accuses the Turkish authorities of ignoring the militants' lucrative oil smuggling business on Turkey's border.
That money could be stopped. The money they get from smuggling could be stopped if the Turkish government and the neighbor countries had decided that they shouldn't get a coin.
A Turkish government official told us that 6,000 people are now banned from Turkey because of fears they could slip over the border into Syria or Iraq to fight with ISIS. But Scott, he also told us that Turkey has a 500-mile-long border with Syria, and it's simply impossible to stop everyone who wants to join the cause of the Islamic extremists.
There is breaking news in a story that we have long been investigating. There has been an arrest in one of the biggest pharmaceutical disasters ever. At least 751 people came down with meningitis and other infections, and 64 died after getting tainted steroid injections. Those injections were produced by a Boston compounding pharmacy. That is a pharmacy that makes custom drugs. Well, today, a supervisor at that facility was arrested at Logan Airport as he was about to leave for Hong Kong. Jim Axelrod now on what he's accused of doing.
Tonight, Glenn Chin, who was head pharmacist for the New England Compounding Center, stands charged with 1 count of mail fraud for labeling steroids as sterile and safe for human use when he knew they weren't. FDA investigators say Chin instructed pharmacy technicians to mislabel medication to indicate it was properly sterilized and tested, and fraudulently complete cleaning logs in the labs. The affidavit states the NECC then shipped those tainted steroids to pain doctors in Michigan, who unknowingly injected them into their patients. 217 got fungal infections, including meningitis, in one clinic alone. 15 of them died. Joe Connolly worked for Chin as a lab tech at NECC. In an interview with Scott Pelley for 60 Minutes, he says he warned his boss about the contamination risks.
When you went to your supervisor and told him that, he said what?
That's verbatim. He shrugged. That was his response for a lot of our questions or comments or concerns. It was a shrug.
One of the company's owners, Barry Cadden, also didn't appear worried about oversight from state inspectors when he spoke to his sales staff as NECC started ramping up production. We obtained this internal training video.
They have no clue. They go around, they're like, oh, Barry's place looks great. Yeah, I gotta go. A cup of coffee, and they go out the door. Really, that's what it is like.
But after hundreds were sickened in 20 states, federal inspectors shut down the company's plant west of Boston after finding standing water, mold, and fungus. The lab was located in the same building as a recycling company, another business owned by Cadden and his family. Chin's arrest marks the first criminal charges, but with a grand jury still considering evidence after a nearly 2-year investigation, probably not the last. Mike Sullivan is a former United States attorney in Boston.
If I were kind of in that chain, that organizational chain, I would not be breathing a sigh of relief after reading that. I'd continue to be concerned about whether or not I'm going to be implicated if I was anywhere in that chain.
Glenn Chin's lawyer says his client was headed to Hong Kong with a round-trip ticket to attend a family wedding, and that his arrest at Logan Airport this morning was, quote, ridiculous and a publicity stunt.
And we understand a grand jury is still deciding whether to file charges against others in the case. Jim, thanks very much. Today, the U.S. Department of Justice launched a broad investigation into the police force of Ferguson, Missouri. A grand jury is already investigating last month's shooting death of an unarmed black man by a white police officer. But Justice correspondent Bob Orr tells us this new federal probe will go far beyond that.
Attorney General Eric Holder said on his visit to Ferguson, Missouri last month, he heard numerous stories of a largely white police force clashing with a majority African-American population.
People consistently express concerns stemming from specific alleged incidents, from general policing practices, and from the lack of diversity on the Ferguson police force.
Holder said those accounts and a review of policing records helped persuade him that a Justice Department civil rights investigation was necessary.
Our investigation will assess the police department's use of force, including deadly force. It will analyze stops, searches, and arrests.
Ferguson was racked by violence after the shooting death of Michael Brown. Police repeatedly clashed with protesters. Today, Ferguson officials welcomed the Justice Department probe and said in a statement, our collaborative efforts are another step forward as we continue the process of earning back the trust of our residents and our neighbors. The civil rights action comes on top of an ongoing FBI investigation, specifically into the circumstances surrounding this shooting. Federal prosecutors are trying to determine if Officer Darren Wilson violated Brown's rights in killing the unarmed teenager.
For now, civil rights investigators are focused solely on the police department in Ferguson, but federal officials say the probe could be expanded to other nearby police forces, Scott, if evidence suggests more widespread problems.
And a decision on whether to charge the officer is likely weeks away. Bob Orr, thanks very much. Former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell and his wife Maureen were found guilty today of taking bribes from a businessman. The corruption trial was full of surprises, most notably when McDonnell took the stand and tried to blame it all on his wife. Now both face prison. Chip Reed's following the case.
Leaving the federal courthouse in Richmond today, Bob McDonnell told reporters, all I can say is my trust remains in the Lord. He left in one car, his wife Maureen in another. A short time earlier, the former governor sobbed loudly as the clerk read the verdict, finding him and his wife guilty on almost all counts. 11 counts of corruption for him, 8 counts of corruption, and 1 count of obstruction for her. They were convicted of accepting about $165,000 in gifts and low-interest loans from businessman Johnny Williams, including a $20,000 New York shopping spree for her, a $6,500 Rolex for him, and luxurious vacations for both, including the use of a Ferrari. In exchange, the prosecution successfully argued that the McDonnells used their official positions as governor and first lady to promote Williams' diet supplement business. McDonnell's attorney Hank Asbill said he was shocked by the verdict and intends to appeal.
We're very disappointed, but we're not deterred. This fight is a long way from over.
On the stand for 24 hours over 5 days, McDonnell argued that he could not have conspired with his wife because their marriage was so broken they barely spoke. He also blamed his wife for accepting many of the gifts, leaving him in the dark. The jury apparently rejected those arguments. It is a dramatic fall for McDonnell, who ran for office as a family values conservative and was considered as a possible running mate for Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney. He was even mentioned as a future presidential candidate himself. Sentencing is scheduled for January 6th, and Scott, if these convictions are not overturned on appeal, both McConnells could be looking at the possibility of decades in federal prison.
Chip Reed in Washington. Chip, thanks very much. A special prison strike force is helping to keep the peace tonight at a juvenile detention center in Nashville. Twice this week, teenagers there went wild. First, there was an escape, and then a riot last night. Mark Strassman's following this.
The Woodland Hills facility was bedlam for 5 hours overnight. Juvenile offenders, armed with sticks and poles, busted out of their dorms. 6 teens became a mob of 24. SWAT teams posted outside watched some rioters shoot off fire extinguishers. Others chased away and attacked unarmed guards. 2 staff members were hurt. By 5 a.m., a dozen riot police had moved in, handcuffed the rioters, and restored control.
They can all walk out of their rooms at any time they want to the common area. And when they came out of their rooms, they breached the door and they got out.
James Henry is commissioner of Tennessee's Department of Children's Services. He said for the second time this week, teens got loose by kicking out aluminum panels under windows.
They were able to knock those doors out again because they'd done it the night before very quickly.
On Monday night, 32 teens escaped the same facility. They broke out of their dorms, pulled up a section of chain-link fence, and ran for a nearby highway. 6 of those escapees remain at large.
Most of them are from single-family parents. Some of them have been raised in a criminal element. Most of them are angry, which is, I would be too if I was raised in that.
The strike force on duty tonight has been authorized to use non-lethal force if necessary, and the fence that rings that compound will be reinforced with a concrete base. One more note, Scott. The 10 ringleaders from last night's riot have been transferred to a different juvenile detention facility.
We got our first look today at one of the largest creatures that ever walked the earth, a dinosaur that weighed as much as a 737. The remains were discovered a decade ago in Argentina and taken by scientists to Philadelphia. Don Daler is there.
So this starts the tale of Dreadnoughtus shrani.
With a 30-foot-long tail and a neck that stretched 2 stories into the air, Dreadnoughtus shrani was king of the giants, 7 times the size of a T-Rex.
That's a toe.
That's a toe?
Yeah.
Why Dreadnoughtus?
Well, when you're 65 tons, you're not going to really have any enemies. And that made me start to think of the turn of the last century warships, the dreadnoughts, which were the first real steel battleships and essentially impervious to previous technology. And so I thought Dreadnoughtus fears nothing.
Paleontologist Ken Lacavara discovered the 85-foot-long dinosaur in Argentina when he spotted a part of a thigh bone.
This was the discovery piece, and this bone was laying horizontally just beneath the desert surface. By the end of the first day, after we had those 10 bones, we knew there was a decent chance that it was a new species. And then after about a year total of field work, well, we were on paleontological cloud 9, I guess you would say.
It turned out to be the most intact large dinosaur skeleton ever found.
In the case of Dreadnoughtus, these animals got caught up in a river flood, and they end up in this soupy mix of sand and mud, kind of like quicksand.
And that's how you were able to find such a relatively complete skeleton.
That's correct.
Lacavara's team spent 9 years excavating the fossils, packing them in plaster, and shipping them back to his lab at Drexel University in Philadelphia.
When you find something and you know it's new, especially when you have a good idea that it's a new species, you're sitting out there in the desert and you realize, I'm the first person to ever see this. I'm the first person that knows this. That's a very special experience for any scientist.
Lacavara has to return the fossils to Argentina by the end of this year. In order to continue studying them, the paleontologists digitally scanned every bone.
You can do this in a virtual space and it just opens it up to the world.
Hidden from sight for 77 million years, Dreadnoughtus shrani is now visible to all.
But somebody got to get punished for this. Not only in money, but in penitentiary they should go. That's my opinion. Bottom line, trying to save money. Trying to save an almighty dollar, and poor people lost their lives. Plenty of people forgot about that. 11 people lost daddies, husbands, sons. Until I see somebody go to jail and I don't feel justice.
BP is a big company. They deserve to make a good profit for the risk that they take. But they have to do it in a safe manner. Common practices, best practices have to be followed. And there's no question with this ruling, and I think we all knew, that there were a lot of shortcuts taken to save money. That is unconscionable. And they should pay for that. They should pay dearly for that. We are hoping and praying that BP pays with cash dearly, and that the majority of that money goes to where the majority of the damage happened, and that's right here in Louisiana. If we could get a hold of that money, we could carefully plan coastal erosion battle and reclaim the land here that those same oil companies principally destroyed. There's a lot of other reasons, but those are the principal guys that were supposed to fix what they did. And here's another example of them not fixing what they did.
A gunshot victim lays on the operating table at a Chicago hospital located near some of the most troubled neighborhoods on the south and west side. Gun violence is so closely associated with Chicago, the Windy City has picked up another nickname, Chirac, which is why the Navy has started a program to train medics who will work in war zones here.
The main idea is to get our corpsmen and our nurses down here, because when we're stateside, we don't do trauma while we're in the Navy, and so we want to get them down here and involved taking care of penetrating trauma, because that's what we take care of overseas all the time. And this is one of the major hospitals in the country where we deal with a lot of penetrating trauma.
At this hospital, they treated nearly 600 gunshot victims last year alone. And while there are no IEDs exploding in Chicago, there are parallels in the care given here.
And so you'd have a lot of injuries perhaps from landmines and IEDs, and here we'll have high-speed car crashes, which can cause similar types of injuries to the extremities. And so then you need to do hemorrhage control here or there. And a lot of the skills are very transferable.
Before deploying to Afghanistan, Navy Petty Officer 2nd Class Dwight Kuntz received 6 months of basic skills for his job as a corpsman and 2 months of field training dealing with combat casualties.
We are embedded with them. We become part of their unit, and we do everything that the Marines do. And then when one of them goes down, we're the first ones there to take care of them.
This is his first time training in a civilian hospital.
This morning, it was full of patients who had gunshot wounds and then a car accident, and all 4 of them went to the operating room. 3 of them went to the operating room today, so it gets very busy here.
The civilian-military partnership aiming to better prepare those who serve.
2.5 months after the death of his young son, Justin Ross Harris is now facing murder charges.
Whether or not the state seeks the death penalty in this case will be made decision-wise on or before that arraignment date in the next 2 to 3 weeks.
Authorities in Cobb County, Georgia say 22-month-old Cooper Harris died after his father left him in a hot car. He was there for 7 hours. Harris told police he'd planned to drive his son to daycare. Instead, he drove to work, not realizing Cooper was strapped in his car seat. Among the charges he's facing, cruelty to children, felony murder, and malice murder.
Today was another step in a long process. We look forward to the case running its course and ultimately justice being served in this matter.
At a hearing in July, police testified Harris was sitting in his office the day his son died, exchanging nude photographs with several women, including a teenager. He's been in jail since his arrest.
The war is winding down here in Afghanistan. Most NATO forces have already gone home. Others are expected to leave by the end of this year. Afghan forces are expected to assume full responsibility for security. It's one of the top agendas of NATO summit in Wales. US, however, plans to leave a residual force behind. These Afghans know that. They do not sound against this strategy, but they did remind US about its mistakes.
US and NATO did not do anything for the people of Afghanistan. They only kept supporting the corrupt officials who pocketed billions of aid money.
They have also called on NATO heads of state to help their next government have a strong police force and army. Afghan forces are largely dependent on foreign aid. They are not well trained and fully equipped to fight the Taliban insurgents. Taliban remain a strong and resilient force. This terrorist group kills civilians in large numbers. No one here denies this.
US and NATO have not fully supported our forces. Afghan forces and police still do not have better weapons than the Taliban, so we call on NATO in Wales to fully support our forces.
Amnesty International has also touched on NATO legacy. It says that NATO risks leaving Afghanistan with a legacy of impunity, unless those foreign troops responsible for the deaths of civilians are brought to justice. In a recent report, Amnesty International documented the almost complete lack of justice for 1,800 civilian casualties caused by NATO operations between 2009 and 2013. NATO waged the war here to what they say dismantle the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and that promote democracy. However, 13 years on, unrest is still rising, and it's local people who are suffering the most. Billions of dollars have been spent here to contain violence and change the lives of Afghans. But that did not happen. Local people are said to have little benefited from the aid. Unemployment and poverty still remain a huge problem. So this is the legacy that NATO is leaving behind.
The Palestinian Authority is set to drag Israel before the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, over its aggression against Palestinians. Senior Fatah official Mohammed Ashtiya said the indictment against Tel Aviv and all necessary documents are ready to be submitted to the ICC. He said the Palestinian Authority is very serious in this regard, adding that this time it will not call for negotiations with Israel, but will demand a timetable for the regime to end its occupation of Palestinian territories. All Palestinians are angry at Israel's recent war on Gaza and its latest announcement to grab a huge chunk of Palestinian territories for its settlements in the occupied West Bank. To discuss that further, and I joined Mr. James Morris, who is a political commentator, and he's joining us live now on the line from Los Angeles. Mr. Morris, how do you feel about this move to the ICC by the Palestinian Authority? We've been speaking about it for a very long time. Do you think it will, A, finally happen? And secondly, what do you think will come out of it?
Thank you for having me back on Press TV again. You can go to my blog, america-hijack.com, which you can also get to by going to ushijack.com. I think it's an excellent idea for the Palestinians to take Israel to the International Criminal Court. The only problem there is you have Zionist influence at the International Criminal Court, and I don't know how far a case can go, even though it has grounds, Israeli war crimes against Gaza with over 2,000 people murdered, many women and children. I believe the number is 2,140. Killed, with over 11,000 injured. Israel obviously had run out of military targets in Gaza in a few days and had deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure to include UN schools and safe havens, like we saw Israel do in Qana in Lebanon back in 1996 and also in 2006. It's a rogue regime. The U.S. helped support that rogue regime. I think there might be more success in taking it to another authority like the World Court, like the international community was able to do with the apartheid wall, and they got a ruling. I believe it came down. I think it was from the International Criminal Court would be another way to go, as I've mentioned here. But I don't know if it can go as far as that international ruling against Israel with regard to the apartheid wall. And of course, no notice was taken though by the U.S. and Britain because of Zionist influence in both of those countries. You have AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee in America, that has heavy influence. It's not just AIPAC, it's the neoconservatives, which are the upper echelon of the Israel lobby, which have influence on the Republican Party, and also on the Democrats, as we see with Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. But any move to address Israeli genocide in Gaza would be a good move, because I just don't see it ending. We may have a stay in that for the moment, or let's say a temporary ceasefire, but I just heard on the news recently that Israel was going after Gaza fishermen again, even though they were within the parameters of 10 kilometers, and I heard that was supposed to be expanded to 12 nautical miles by the end of 2014. We'll see if that happens. So the only way to really address Israeli apartheid is to pursue it at the International Criminal Court and at other international bodies. to try to seek justice for the Palestinians. But I just don't know how far it will go with the Zionist influence we see in the U.S. and in other countries as well. But we also have to look at this agenda for the Middle East. It goes back to what I've been discussing, and we see it playing out with ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and what the Zionists are trying to do with Iran and Lebanon and elsewhere. Again, you can read more about it at my USHijack.com blog. And that, of course, is the Israeli Likudnik Oded Yinon strategy for Israel in the 1980s. The Israelis have no intention of making any kind of peace deal with the Palestinians. We see that with the continued land grab like we saw outside of Jerusalem here that's been mentioned in the news recently. The main reason the Gaza campaign, or mowing the lawn as Israel likes to call it every few years, had happened was because of the unity government between Fatah and Hamas. And Israel did not like that, as I've mentioned previously on Press TV, because that would put additional pressure on Israel for a two-state solution. And we know by the continued land grabs that two-state solution is just a charade. Again, it goes back to that Israeli Oded Yinon plan, where Israel wanted to cut off any support for the Palestinians, including Saddam Hussein with Iraq, the Iranians, Syria, who not only supports the Palestinians, but supports Hezbollah, another resistance group to Israel based in Lebanon, of course. It's all about the greater Israel agenda, and unfortunately there's so much Zionist influence in America, Britain, and other countries, to include Canada, the EU with the Transatlantic Institute, that it's very difficult, but resistance is the only way, and pursuing it at the International Criminal Court as well. Again, go to my USHijack.com blog for more.
Okay, and we'll leave it at that. But of course, as always, we appreciate you speaking to us. It was James Morris, who is speaking to us live on the line from Los Angeles. Well, the Palestinian Authority says reconstruction of the Gaza Strip, devastated during 50 days of Israeli aggression, will cost $7.7 billion. Palestinian experts assessing the damage of Israel's offensive say the process would take 5 years if Israel removes its blockade over Gaza entirely. The offensive cost the lives of more than 2,100 Gazans, destroyed 17,000 homes, severely damaged the enclave's sole power plant, and burned dozens of factories. The UN says over 100,000 Gazan residents were also displaced to UN shelters and host families. A conference of international donors for the reconstruction of Gaza is set to take place later this month in either Egypt or Norway.
This is the main road leading to Al-Quneitra and its countryside, where heavy fighting has been raging since August. Jabba is a village surrounded by strategic hills controlled by the army units east of Al-Quneitra. Militants have been attacking the hills all day with mortars in preparation to infiltrate and take over the area.
Militants are trying to take control of strategic locations like Mashara and Sha'ar Hills. This is not the first time they attack. They're trying so hard because if they reach the hills, they would control the Quneitra countryside, but all their attacks were foiled.
Militants' mortar attacks caused a number of injuries. We headed to Al-Sha'ar Hill, which was one of the targets of militants. We ran over the hill to avoid the mortars and reached the army positions, which were responding to the fire. The Syrian army is targeting militants in the surroundings of Nab al-Sakhr area here in Al-Quneitra countryside. Militants have been trying to infiltrate into this area and take army positions. Mamtane, Nab al-Sakhr, Umbatne and Majdolia are all villages which militants used as base to launch their attacks. Army units said they have foiled their attempts many times and cut their supply lines.
We have cut the main road which militants use for infiltration and transportation between Dara and Quneitra countryside. Thousands of militants are coming from all over the world, but here they will be squashed.
Foreign-backed militants have launched their offensive against the governorate in August to take control of the city of Al-Quneitra and its countryside. The Israeli forces have been assisting the militants on the borders and harboring them many times during the unrest.